In a congressional hearing that shocked the nation, Jasmine Crockett and Elise Stefanik clashed over one of America's most divisive issues, DEI in government. What started as a routine policy review turned into a war of words, with Crockett's voice shaking as she exposed a brutal injustice, and Stefanik firing back with accusations of reverse discrimination. Inside that marble-walled chamber, half the room erupted in applause. The other half sat frozen in rage. And when the vote came down, the real question wasn't who won. It was, what if justice never stood a chance to begin with? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The Capitol felt more like a battlefield than a chamber of law. It was September 2025, and the Oversight Committee had called a high-stakes hearing to reevaluate DEI programs in federal agencies. Chairwoman Elise Stefanik presided with icy poise, her voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. We're here to determine whether DEI has become a tool to divide. On the other side sat Jasmine Crockett, stone-faced but burning inside. This wasn't just political theater for her. This was survival. This was truth. Cameras clicked, aides whispered, and the air buzzed with unspoken hostility. The chamber split visibly down ideological lines, conservatives rigid and ready to gut DEI, progressives bracing to defend it. Stefanik's gaze never wavered as she delivered her final blow. Congresswoman Crockett, why should we spend taxpayer money on programs that give special treatment to certain groups? It wasn't a question. It was bait. Jasmine didn't flinch. Behind her sat government workers who had been told they were only there to fill quotas, people whose lives she had vowed to defend. As the light above her mic blinked green, she straightened, eyes sharp. Outside, a storm gathered. Inside, the real lightning was about to strike. And just like that, the storm Jasmine had sensed finally cracked open, loud, calculated, and aimed straight at the foundation she stood on. Elise Stefanik rose with practiced ease, a calm smirk painted across her face, as if she were presenting numbers on a spreadsheet, not dismantling a lifeline for millions. "Let's stop pretending," she said, her voice crisp, steady, and disturbingly serene. "DEI is no longer about fairness. It's become a dangerous ideology, one that divides instead of unites, that punishes one group to elevate another." Her words hung heavy in the room, like smoke after a shot fired. "We are witnessing reverse discrimination in real time," she continued, locking eyes with no one yet speaking to everyone. "And the government has no business playing social referee." That line, "no business playing social referee," hit like a thunderclap. Half the room erupted in applause, led by Republican aides and invited think tank figures in tailored suits. The other half froze. Democrats, civil rights leaders, and federal workers of color, faces tight with disbelief, arms crossed in silent protest. Jasmine sat still, every muscle in her body coiled, not from surprise but from recognition. She had fought this argument in courtrooms and on city blocks. But here, under the Capitol dome, it was dressed in suits and smiles, and it was winning cheers. Stefanik took her seat like a queen, laying down the first move in a rigged game of chess. The gavel hadn't struck, but the damage was done. The narrative was shifting, intentionally, methodically. She had reframed DEI not as a safety net, but as a threat. Jasmine's name hadn't even been mentioned, yet she could feel it. Her work, her identity, her very presence on this committee had just been reduced to a footnote in someone else's culture war. Across the aisle, phones buzzed, press feeds lit up with clips. "Stefanik, government shouldn't be social police." It was clean. It was dangerous. And it had just turned the air in the room from tense to volatile. For a moment, the room froze, not from confusion, but from anticipation. Jasmine Crockett didn't rush. She sat still, shoulders square, spine straight, eyes steady. Then, in a voice that didn't beg to be heard but commanded attention, she spoke. "DEI doesn't divide America," she said slowly, letting each word fall with weight. "What divides us, what has always divided us, is silence. The silence that comes when someone's passed over for a job they earned, and no one says a word. The silence when a black woman is interrupted again and again in a meeting, and everyone acts like it didn't happen. The silence when a young man with a Spanish last name gets followed through a store while his white classmate walks free. That's what breaks this country. That's what keeps the wound open. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The power wasn't in volume, it was in truth. You call DEI a dangerous idea, she continued, eyes locking briefly on Stefanik. But what's dangerous is pretending this country has always played fair. What's dangerous is rewriting history to erase who's been left out and why. DEI isn't about giving special treatment. It's about finally acknowledging the imbalance that's been ignored for generations. It's about asking hard questions instead of hiding behind polite indifference. She paused just long enough to let that settle. You want to talk about fairness? Then let's talk about the rules. Because if the rules were really fair, DEI wouldn't be necessary. But they're not, and we both know it. She leaned in, her voice softening, but only slightly. The real threat to America isn't people asking for a seat at the table. The real threat is when those in power pretend the table was never tilted in the first place. Her words hung in the air like thick smoke, impossible to ignore and impossible to deny. She didn't let the moment pass. Jasmine leaned forward, locking eyes with no one and everyone at once, her voice steady but heavy, like the beginning of a story you didn't want to hear but needed to. "Let me make this plain," she said, her words cutting through the silence like slow, deliberate footsteps in a quiet room. "There's a man I know, black, born and raised in Texas, who served this country twice. First in uniform, then in public service. 10 years in a federal agency, always early, stayed late, covered for others, trained new hires. He did everything right. Never caused a problem, never asked for special treatment. His record was clean. His evaluations were strong. People came to him for answers. He knew that place better than anyone. And then came a promotion." She paused, not for drama, but because the weight of what came next deserved space. He applied, just like everyone else. No shortcuts, no favors. He had the experience, the qualifications, the seniority. In fact, he had trained the man who got the job. But when the list came out, his name wasn't on it. No interview, not even a follow-up. He went to his supervisor and asked, calmly, respectfully, if there was something he could have done better. And what they told him, off the record of course, was that he just didn't fit the culture. That's what they said. Not his skills, not his results, not his professionalism, just culture. Jasmine exhaled, but her eyes stayed fierce. "Now let me translate that," she said, her voice tighter now. "Not the culture means your voice is too deep, your manner too direct, your hair too natural, your presence too strong. It means we're comfortable with your work, but not with you. It means we liked what you did for the team, but we're not ready for someone like you to lead it. It means we're okay with you being useful, but not visible." She let the room absorb that. The silence was no longer passive, it was uncomfortable, uneasy, because everyone in that chamber knew the story didn't just belong to one man. It belonged to thousands, maybe millions. "And he didn't make a scene," she went on. "He didn't threaten a lawsuit. He didn't scream. He just went back to work like nothing happened. But months later, in a quiet moment, he told me something I've never forgotten. He said, 'I really believed in the system. I believed if I worked hard, followed the rules, kept my head down, I'd get my chance. But now, I don't even think there ever was a chance.'" Jasmine let that sit. No theatrics, no pitch in her voice, just the raw weight of betrayal. "That," she said slowly, "is why DEI matters. Not because it gives handouts, but because it forces people to see what they've been trained to ignore. It asks the hard question, why do people like him keep getting told they don't belong, without anyone ever saying it out loud?" Her words didn't echo, but they didn't have to. They stayed, hung in the room like smoke after something had already burned. But as Jasmine's words echoed through the room, raw, painful, unshakably human, Elise Stefanik shifted in her seat, eyes narrowing, fingers tapping impatiently against her folder. The power in Jasmine's story had landed hard, and Stefanik knew it. But she wasn't about to let that moment stand. With practiced poise, she leaned forward into her mic, voice cool, sharpened to cut. "Congresswoman Crockett," she began, her tone deceptively calm. "I think we just heard a powerful example, not of injustice, but of victimhood dressed up as virtue." A low murmur moved through the chamber, but Stefanik pressed forward, unbothered. "You keep telling us that systems are broken, that outcomes are unfair. But what I hear, over and over, is blame. It's always the system, always some shadow force keeping people down. Never a moment of personal responsibility." She adjusted her chair, lifted her chin, and continued as if she were teaching a lesson. "This obsession with oppression, it's exhausting. Not every disappointment is discrimination. Not every no means the game is rigged. Sometimes people don't get promoted because they didn't earn it." Her tone never wavered, but the air around her words turned icy. "And let's be honest," she said, looking squarely in Jasmine's direction now. "Programs like DEI, they've become a shield. A shield for people who don't meet the standard but expect a shortcut. A shield for people who want leadership without merit, who want positions of power they haven't earned because they check the right box." That last sentence hit like a slap in a quiet room. Stefanik didn't blink. She let the silence thicken before twisting the knife further. "When you elevate someone based on what they are, instead of what they've done, you insult the very idea of excellence. You send the message that identity matters more than achievement, that mediocrity, wrapped in diversity, is somehow progress." A few heads nodded behind her. Phones clicked, but most of the room just stared, frozen, unsure if they had just witnessed a political statement or a personal attack. Stefanik knew exactly what she had done. She wasn't just challenging DEI. She was challenging the legitimacy of anyone who had ever benefited from it, especially people who looked like Jasmine. And Jasmine? She didn't move. She didn't interrupt. But the weight of what had just been said wasn't lost on her. It wasn't just an attack on a program. It was an attack on her story, her career, her identity. The implication was clear. If you've had help, if you've faced barriers and dared to name them, then maybe you were never good enough to begin with. The words didn't just sting. They threatened to erase everything she stood for. And Stefanik sat back, satisfied. Not because she had proven a point, but because she had turned a wound into a weapon, and smiled while doing it. The room was frozen, not just quiet, but paralyzed. Elise Stefanik's words still hung in the air like smoke after a match had been dropped in a dry forest. Everyone could feel it. The shift, the sting, the invisible line that had just been crossed. But Jasmine didn't react right away. She didn't fidget, didn't adjust her mic. She just sat there, perfectly still, as if absorbing the full weight of what had been said. Her eyes didn't flinch, but there was something behind them, something ancient, something tired. The tired that comes not from one insult, but from years of coded language, dismissive stares, and doors slammed in faces that never got a key. She inhaled slowly, like she was holding something back. Not tears, but fire. And then she spoke. That statement, her voice was quiet but sharp, each syllable as deliberate as a courtroom verdict. That didn't just insult me. She paused, her hands now resting flat on the desk, fingers gently pressed together. That insulted millions of Americans, people who get up every morning and try to do what's right, people who work twice as hard to be seen half as clearly, people who show up with their resumes, their experience, their integrity, and still get told they're not the right fit. Her voice didn't rise, but it grew heavier, each word carrying the weight of every person who had ever been passed over, overlooked, or quietly erased. They're not looking for special treatment. They're just looking for a fair shot. And every time someone like you calls it victimhood, you're not criticizing a policy. You're denying their reality. The room didn't move, no whispers, no shifting. Just silence, thick, electric, waiting. Jasmine leaned forward slightly now, her tone calm but fierce. You say DEI is a crutch? That it gives unqualified people opportunities they don't deserve? She shook her head slowly, voice tightening. Let me tell you what's undeserved. Being told you don't belong after you've already proven you do. Being told to wait your turn when you've been standing at the door for years. Being made to feel like your presence is a problem before you even open your mouth. She looked directly at Stefanik then, unshaken, unafraid. You don't have to say the quiet part out loud. We hear it. We live it. Every single day she let the silence return, not because she needed a break, but because the truth needed room to echo. And in that stillness, something shifted. Not politically, not even publicly, but humanly. It was the moment the room realized this wasn't about Jasmine versus Elise. This was about whether the people in power could admit they'd been blind for too long, and whether they had the courage to finally see. And as the silence tightened once again, Jasmine leaned back in her chair, not to retreat, but to reach into something deeper, something that didn't come from law books or party lines, something that lived in her bones. Her fingers gently tapped the wood of the desk, once, twice, as if steadying herself against the weight of memory. Her voice, when it finally returned, was quieter, but not soft. It was the kind of quiet that demanded listening. "You want to know why I care so much?" And she said, not to Elise Stefanik, not even to the room, but to something larger, the idea of America that had always promised justice and yet kept breaking that promise in plain sight. "It's not because I read a report or followed a trend. It's because I lived it. I bled for it, in rooms where no one clapped, where no cameras rolled, and no one cared what party I was with. Before Congress, before microphones. I was a public defender in Texas, and every single day I stood on the front lines of a system that claimed to be fair, but wasn't. Not even close." She paused and looked around the room, not for effect, but to remind every person sitting there that this wasn't theory. This wasn't an abstract policy debate. This was real. I represented people who couldn't afford an attorney. Some barely had a place to sleep. Black men arrested for traffic stops that turned into life-changing charges. Women thrown in jail for writing a bad check because they had to choose between groceries and gas. I remember sitting beside a 17-year-old kid who'd stolen a pair of sneakers. First offense. Honor roll student. He cried in my office, not because he got caught, but because he knew, even at 17, that the judge would never see that version of him. Only the cuffs, only the hoodie, only the color of his skin. Jasmine's voice cracked just slightly, but she didn't stop. I stood in courtrooms where prosecutors laughed when they saw my client's last name, where the bailiff called me sweetheart instead of counsel, where a judge once told me I was too passionate for someone so young, code for too loud, too black, too female. I had cases where the evidence was weak, the timeline didn't add up, the witness had doubts, and still my clients were found guilty in under 10 minutes. Her hand clenched the desk for a second and then released. "And do you know what they always told us? Just trust the system. Let it work." She looked up then, locking eyes with the lawmakers before her. "But the system doesn't work when it only works for some people. The system doesn't work when zip codes and skin color carry more weight than facts. The system doesn't work when juries don't reflect the communities they're judging. It doesn't work when a white college student caught with cocaine gets rehab, but a black teenager with marijuana gets 10 years. I saw it. I lived it. Every single day." The room was silent. No one dared move. Even Elise Stefanik had gone still. "And I want you to hear me clearly," Jasmine said, her voice growing stronger now, pulling from the same fire that had carried her through those endless courtrooms. "I didn't fight for DEI because I wanted handouts. I didn't believe that anyone should be given a job they didn't earn. But I also I knew that so many brilliant, qualified, hardworking people never even got the chance to compete. Because the door was already shut before they reached it. Because someone saw their name on a resume and made a decision. Because someone heard their voice and made an assumption. Because someone looked at their face and decided they weren't the right fit." She leaned forward again, eyes narrowing, but not in anger, in clarity. DEI is not a free pass. It's not about skipping the line. It's about tearing down the barriers that were never supposed to be there in the first place. It's about recognizing that some people walk into the room carrying 10 times the weight and still manage to stand tall. It's about asking this country to live up to the words it wrote in its own founding documents. Equal justice under law. Remember that? A long, heavy silence followed. You say DEI is about giving people a leg up, she said, turning slightly toward Stefanik. But I say it's about removing the foot that's been on their necks for generations. When I stood beside those clients in courtrooms that didn't believe in them, I wasn't asking for them to be favored. I was asking for them to be seen, to be heard, to be treated like they mattered. She swallowed hard. Her voice lowered again, but the fire behind it remained. You don't forget what it feels like to stand in a hallway with a mother clutching her purse, asking if her son will go home tonight, and knowing the odds are against him before he even walks into the courtroom. You don't forget the way people look at you when you walk in wearing a suit and they still think you're there to clean the floor. You don't forget how small you have to make yourself just to be allowed in the room. Another pause. This one longer, deeper. I carry those memories with me every day I walk into this building, she said, looking around the chamber. I carry them because they remind me that my job is not just to pass laws. It's to make sure the people we forget, the people we overlook, the people we silence, are never left behind again. And with that, Jasmine leaned back in her chair. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't demand applause. But the impact of her words settled over the room like dust after a battle. It was the sound of truth, not abstract, not partisan, not rehearsed, just lived, just real, and no one could look away. The air was already heavy when Elise Stefanik leaned back in her chair, smoothed her jacket, and spoke with deliberate calm. Too calm for what came next. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't blink. But her words carried a chill that dropped the temperature in the room. You want to talk about injustice? She said almost casually. Then let's talk about the Americans who are being held, without fair process, for their involvement on January 6th. I still believe they are political prisoners, and I don't regret saying that. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The words hovered in the room like smoke from a gun still warm. Jasmine didn't react right away. Neither did the reporters. Neither did the aides. Everyone sat stunned, not because they didn't expect fire, but because Stefanik had just taken it to another level. The kind of level where reality bends and wounds are picked open on purpose. Stefanik went on, cool and unbothered. They were scared. They were frustrated. They were standing up, like Americans have done since the revolution. And now, they've been made examples of. Harsh sentences, solitary confinement, forgotten by their country for a moment of outrage. She glanced across the room like she just laid down some inconvenient truth, something she expected no one to challenge. But Jasmine didn't let the silence linger. She sat forward, slowly, her hands gripping the table, her voice low and measured at first, but shaking with the weight of memory. I was here, she said. Just that. 3 words. And suddenly the room felt like it was tipping. I was in this building. I remember the sound of the glass breaking. I remember locking my office door, turning off the lights, and hiding under my desk while grown men screamed through the halls, chanting for blood. I remember texting my family to say I loved them, just in case I didn't make it out. She looked up, eyes locked on Stefanik. And you dare call those people political prisoners? Now her voice rose, sharper, clearer, each word landing like thunder. They came here with ropes, with zip ties, with bear spray and body armor. They beat police officers with American flags. They brought a Confederate banner into the Capitol of the United States. They scrawled death threats on doors. And you want to compare them to peaceful protesters? To people who marched with signs, not weapons? Her hands were shaking now, not from rage, but from the kind of deep hurt that doesn't fade with time. I sat in my office with the lights off and my hand over my mouth, trying not to breathe too loud. She continued, I remember hearing footsteps run past my door. Boots, heavy, fast. I didn't know if I would be dragged out. I didn't know if I would live. And you're here in this building years later, calling them the victims? Stefanik opened her mouth, but Jasmine didn't stop. She couldn't. You call them patriots. I call them what they were. Violent, armed, organized, and unrepentant. They didn't storm this building because they loved America. They stormed it because they didn't want America to work. For people like me. For voters who don't look like them. For elections they didn't win. Her voice cracked, but she didn't lower it. And now, instead of standing with those who defended this capital, you stand with the ones who broke it. You want to talk about injustice? Try being a black woman in this country who's told every day to stay quiet, to stay polite, to stay grateful, even when people are calling for your government to fall. By now, chairs had pushed back. Phones were up. Aides were standing. The gavel slammed once. Then again. Order! Security took one step closer to the table. Jasmine didn't flinch, didn't blink. Her voice dropped, but the intensity only deepened. You sit there and speak of outrage like it's some noble cause. But I remember crouching under my desk, hearing the sound of a mob tearing through the halls, and wondering if I would be the next headline. The room was no longer a hearing. It was a reckoning. And Jasmine Crockett had just brought every hidden trauma, every buried truth into the light, whether they were ready to hear it or not. And even as the gavel rang out again and security edged forward, the damage was already done. Not in the chamber, but far beyond its walls. What had begun as a policy hearing had now detonated into something far more combustible, a cultural flashpoint, beamed out live and looped on every screen in America. Within minutes, the networks moved in like vultures sensing blood. Fox News was first. The chyron read, "Crockett melts down, Stefanik holds her ground." A host opened the segment with a smirk. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what happens when facts meet feelings. Elise Stefanik showed real leadership today, refusing to be bullied by emotional theatrics from the radical left. They ran the clip of Jasmine pounding the desk, but cut just before the words, "They came here to kill us." Instead, they looped the phrase, "You dare call them political prisoners?" with ominous music playing underneath. Panels of suited commentators nodded grimly. "She crossed a line," one said. "This is what DEI produces, rage, not results." In less than an hour, the narrative was sealed for one half of the country. Jasmine was unstable. Stefanik was a truth teller. But on the other side of the media battlefield, a very different fire was catching. MSNBC broke in with a somber anchor, her voice trembling slightly as she introduced the clip. "What you're about to see is not just a political moment, it's a human one." Then came the footage, uncut, raw, devastating. Jasmine, voice breaking, recalling the fear of hiding under her desk, the trembling hands, the crack in her voice when she said, "I didn't know if I would live." It aired once, then again, then a third time with subtitles set over quiet piano music. On social media, it exploded like a grenade in the middle of America's conscience. Stand with Crockett began trending by mid-afternoon. Within hours, it overtook everything. TikToks featured young women, Black, Latina, Asian, lip-syncing Jasmine's words. They didn't come to speak, they came to threaten. Instagram pages began sharing side-by-side images. One of Jasmine frozen in testimony, one of a January 6th rioter screaming into the Capitol rotunda. One tried to protect democracy, the other tried to destroy it. Twitter became a digital war zone. Celebrities, veterans, students, and activists posted messages of solidarity. "She said what we've been screaming for years." Others simply posted a black screen with white text, "We hear you, Jasmine." But it wasn't one-sided. Almost immediately, the backlash began. Protect Stefanik surged on Truth Social, then on X. Conservative influencers clipped Jasmine's most emotional outburst and labeled it unhinged. Podcasts framed her as unstable, weaponizing trauma for political gain. This wasn't a hearing, it was a therapy session, one radio host sneered. Others called her a danger to civil discourse and claimed she was demonizing patriots. Hashtags like DEI's racism and Crockett unfit popped up by the thousands, often accompanied by edited clips and bolded captions. Angry, divisive, dangerous. And just like that, the lines were drawn. It was no longer a clash between two congresswomen. It was a referendum on two Americas. To one half of the country, Jasmine Crockett became the face of righteous resistance. A woman who dared to say what many had lived but never spoken aloud. A survivor of a government under siege, still fighting for fairness in a system that kept muting her voice. People saw their mothers, their sisters, their mentors in her. They saw courage under pressure, truth under assault. To the other half, Elise Stefanik was the defender of order, a woman who refused to apologize, who stared down the fury and kept her footing. She was labeled a patriot, a symbol of the real America, the one that was tired of woke victim politics and ready to reclaim its version of truth. Her face was plastered on t-shirts sold online by morning. "I don't apologize for America." The slogan caught fire. Cable news lit up like a battleground map. One channel showed a crowd chanting outside the Capitol, "Jasmine! Jasmine!" Mostly young, mostly black and brown, fists raised in peaceful protest. Another showed a convoy of trucks rolling through Pennsylvania with American flags and signs reading, "Free the J6 prisoners." Mostly white, mostly rural, voices booming with country music and outrage. In coffee shops, classrooms, airport lounges, anywhere a screen could glow, Americans weren't watching a hearing anymore. They were watching a showdown between identities, between memories of January 6th and rewrites of it, between lived experience and strategic erasure, and in the chaos, both women became unwilling symbols. Jasmine didn't ask to become a martyr. She had come to testify, to speak, to defend what she believed in. But now every word she'd said was being dissected, mocked, idolized, weaponized. She was praised as a truth teller, but also called names that wouldn't make it past the network censors. In a single afternoon, she was both hero and target. Elise, too, had crossed a threshold she couldn't retreat from. Her words had lit a match, and now her inbox overflowed. One half filled with gratitude, the other with rage. Some messages called her brave. Others sent death threats. But she didn't walk it back. Instead, she doubled down on evening talk shows repeating, "I said what millions of Americans already feel." And just like that, she hardened into something else entirely. Not just a congresswoman, but a crusader. The hearing room was empty now. The chairs were cold, the gavel silent. But out there, in the country it tried to serve, the hearing had only just begun. Two women, two microphones, two truths, and a nation that could no longer pretend it was just having a conversation. It was choosing a side. But just as the firestorm of public outrage reached its peak, a quieter bomb was ticking in the background, one that didn't explode on a cable news set, but in the shadowed corners of Washington, where loyalty and ambition often trade places behind closed doors. It began not with a headline, but a whisper, a quiet leak to a mid-level political journalist at the Hill. A former Republican staffer who had worked closely with Elise Stefanik in the earlier days of her congressional career came forward anonymously. His claim wasn't loud, it didn't scream treason, but it carried the weight of betrayal. According to this aide, Stefanik had once been a strong, behind-the-scenes supporter of internal DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. She hadn't just nodded along, she had helped write the policies. She'd approved recruitment memos that encouraged hiring veterans, first-generation college students, and yes, women of color. She even praised the idea of broadening our definition of merit in one email from 2021. That email surfaced, then others. A dozen documents followed, emails, calendar invites, draft policy memos. Her name was on every single one. Within hours, screenshots circulated like wildfire. Twitter caught it first, then Reddit, then Instagram infographics. Stefanik's own words were highlighted in bold. "We must build a team that reflects the strength of this nation's diversity," the exact kind of language she now publicly ridiculed as woke favoritism. By 9 a.m. the next morning, Chuck's Elise Exposed trended nationwide. On Fox, conservative commentators scrambled to contain it, calling it an evolution of thinking or staff-driven errors. But on MSNBC, the narrative shifted like a tectonic plate. "She knew DEI mattered," one host said. "She believed it until her ambition told her to abandon it." And Jasmine? She didn't react with celebration. She didn't tweet. She didn't retweet. She just watched it unfold from a distance, arms crossed, lips tight. Because for her, this wasn't about winning the moment. It was about finally understanding the full weight of what she had been fighting all along. That evening, long after the cameras were gone and the halls of Congress had emptied, Jasmine stayed behind. The marble corridors were quiet now, echoing only with the sound of distant footsteps in janitorial carts. She waited. She didn't need a crowd. She needed a reckoning. Then she saw her, Elise Stefanik, walking alone, coat folded neatly over her arm, eyes cast low. She didn't look like the confident, cutting voice from the hearing. She looked smaller, like someone who'd been cornered by her own reflection. Elise, Jasmine called, firm but quiet. Stefanik stopped. She turned around slowly. Her face, once guarded by performance, was bare now, exhausted, alert, hollow. For a moment, nothing was said. The hallway stretched between them like a courtroom without a judge. Jasmine took a step closer, her heels clicking softly against the marble. "You didn't used to sound like that," she said, not as an accusation, but as a reminder. Elise didn't answer. Her silence was louder than any denial. "I saw the documents," Jasmine continued. "Your name's on them. You supported DEI. You wrote that diversity strengthens public service. That inclusive hiring helps America see itself in its institutions. You meant those words." Stefanik opened her mouth slightly, then closed it. Her fingers tightened around the fabric of her coat. "You believed in this," Jasmine said, her voice sharpening, "until it stopped polling well, until it got branded woke. Then you walked away, not from an idea, but from the people that idea was made to protect. You didn't just abandon a policy, you abandoned us." "It's not that simple," Elise finally whispered. "No," Jasmine said, stepping closer. "But it is that cruel." Her tone didn't rise. It dropped, lower, heavier, more human. "You looked people in the eye and told them they mattered, and now you stand behind microphones and call them a threat. You know the story I told in that hearing was true. You know the fear I described was real, but you decided it wasn't worth anything. Not in your party, not in your rise." Elise said nothing. Jasmine's voice broke, just slightly, but she pushed through. "You didn't have to believe in me, but you did believe in the people I stood up for. I know it. I read it. In your words, in your staff notes, in the policies you signed off on. And now, when it matters most, you pretend it never happened. You pretend they never mattered." Elise blinked slowly. Her mouth opened again, but there was nothing left to say. Jasmine took one step back. Her voice softened, but the edge remained like a blade hidden under silk. "You had a choice, Elise, and you chose the applause." And then she turned, leaving Stefanik standing in the pale yellow light of the Capitol hallway, alone with a silence so deafening it felt like judgment. And as the echo of Jasmine's heels faded into the night, the Capitol seemed to exhale, a long, exhausted breath from a building that had seen too much and changed too little. The next morning, the hearing resumed. But something was different now. The room, though packed, felt hollow. Reporters filled the back rows. Staffers whispered. Lawmakers shifted in their chairs with the weariness of people who already knew how the story would end. This wasn't a debate anymore. It was theater. The script had already been written. The votes had already been counted. The gavel came down with a dull thud. The chair read the motion aloud, his voice flat. Motion to repeal DEI-based hiring initiatives across all federal agencies, including training and accountability programs. Motion passes 13-9. The chamber didn't erupt. There was no applause, no protest, just silence, cold, administrative, surgical. A line of ink slashing through years of effort, generations of pain. Jasmine didn't move. She stared forward, her hands folded tightly on the table, as if holding herself together. Around her, others nodded solemnly or shook their heads. One aide blinked back tears, but Jasmine didn't cry. Not here, not now. She stood slowly, the leather of her chair creaking behind her. She gathered her notes, tidy, restrained, and slid them into her folder without a word. As she turned, a photographer raised his camera. She raised her chin. No weakness, no rage, but her eyes, bloodshot, rimmed with quiet devastation, betrayed what her voice would not. She walked the aisle alone. Each step sounded louder than it should have in the marble chamber, like a drum beat, like a heartbeat, like grief with nowhere to go. Behind her, Elise Stefanik sat still, watching. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. Her hands were clasped neatly on the desk in front of her posture perfect, her face unreadable. But her eyes, just briefly, followed Jasmine to the door. And something flickered there. Not pride, not victory, something smaller, sadder. The realization that in gaining what she thought she wanted, she had lost something she couldn't name. A conviction, a truth, a version of herself. She didn't know. All she knew was that the room felt colder now, quieter, not triumphant, but emptied. Outside, the hallway was chaos. Cameras, reporters, flashing lights, questions thrown like daggers. Congresswoman Crockett, do you plan to challenge the repeal legally? Do you think this signals the death of DEI in America? Is this a personal loss for you? She said nothing. She didn't have to. Her silence was thunder. Her stillness was louder than their frenzy. She moved through the crowd like a woman walking through fire, unburned but scorched on the inside. Her eyes stared ahead, unfocused, her jaw clenched, her heart not broken, but pulled in directions no one could see. Because it wasn't just policy that had been voted away. It was years of stories, lives she had fought beside, mothers who had called her at night, crying that their sons had been passed over, arrested, forgotten. Students who had told her, with trembling voices, that they never saw anyone like them in positions of power. Veterans, immigrants, teachers, clerks, people whose names no one would ever print. People who had believed her when she said, "Your story matters." She had carried their voices into the room, and the room had crushed them, not with violence, but with apathy, with a vote. Inside, Elise still hadn't moved. Her aide whispered something in her ear. She didn't respond. Her gaze remained on the door Jasmine had just walked through, as if waiting for something to return. But nothing did. And somewhere deep in her chest, something hollowed out. Because even if she wouldn't admit it, Elise remembered who she used to be. She remembered drafting those memos. She remembered how right it had felt once to talk about equity, not as a threat, but as a promise. She remembered sitting in her office late one night, telling a young staffer that, "We need to hire people who've earned it, but who've also been denied it for too long." Now those words were gone. Now they didn't fit. Now they were a liability. And yet they echoed louder than the gavel that had closed the hearing. She closed her folder and stood. Around her, her colleagues were already moving on, laughing, shaking hands, preparing for their next media hits. One congressman clapped her on the back. "Hell of a fight, Elise." She smiled politely, but it didn't reach her eyes. Because somewhere behind her smile, behind her ambition, behind all the things she had said for applause, there was a part of her that still believed Jasmine had been right, that the country was slipping, that they were choosing comfort over truth, and that maybe, just maybe, the real loss wasn't the repeal of DEI, but the part of themselves they traded away to make it happen. Back outside, Jasmine finally stopped walking. She stood at the top of the Capitol steps, the sky heavy with gray. Reporters were still shouting, but she didn't hear them. Her eyes stared into the distance, toward no one, toward everyone. And in that moment, her voice finally returned, but only as a whisper to herself. They didn't win. They just made it harder to keep fighting. Then with steady breath and slow resolve, she descended the stairs. Not as someone defeated, but as someone who would return, again and again, until the story changed, until the vote meant something different, until the silence stopped being acceptable. And though the hearing chamber had fallen silent and the repeal had been signed into motion, the echo refused to die. It lingered, not in headlines, but in classrooms, kitchens, barbershops, and Sunday pulpits. Like smoke that refused to clear, like a question the country didn't know how to answer. And then exactly 1 month later, The Atlantic dared to put that question on the cover in bold, defiant type. Who are we building this nation for? It wasn't a rhetorical question. It was a mirror, held up to America's face, daring it to look. The article wasn't partisan. It wasn't shrill. It was slow, thoughtful, surgical. It traced the timeline from the January 6th hearings to the DEI repeal, exposing not just what was said, but what was lost. It opened with Jasmine's line from the hearing, "They didn't come to speak, they came to threaten," and then dissected how a nation that claims equality could watch that line go viral and still vote to erase the very programs meant to prevent such threats. This isn't just about diversity policy, the article read. This is about the fear of sharing power and the comfort of keeping things the way they have always been. The piece included images: Jasmine speaking, eyes wet but unbroken; Elise, Stefanik, mid-sentence, expression unreadable; protesters on both sides of the Capitol steps. It ended with a haunting paragraph. Perhaps the real fear isn't that DEI gives too much to too few, but that it asks the powerful to give anything up at all. Across the country, something began to stir. Universities added the article to required reading lists. High school debate teams chose the hearing as their topic. Clergy quoted Jasmine's testimony from their pulpits, placing her words beside scripture. Artists painted murals. One viral TikTok featured an animation of Jasmine's courtroom speech set to orchestral music captioned, "This is what truth sounds like." But Jasmine didn't rest in the spotlight. She didn't go on a victory tour. She returned to the field, back to community centers, labor halls, small churches with leaky roofs and folding chairs. In Birmingham, she stood with sanitation workers fighting discriminatory layoffs. In Oakland, she met with students from underfunded schools whose AP classes had been cut. In Baltimore, she held a town hall where no one wore suits and no one brought scripts, just raw questions and the hunger for something better. And in every room, someone would ask, "How do we keep going when they vote against us?" And she would answer, calm but fierce, "They can take policy, but they can't take voice. They can't take truth, and they can't take your worth." Everywhere she went, people repeated her line back to her like scripture, like armor. "I wasn't born to prove I'm worthy. I was born with worth." It became more than a quote. It became a seed. Meanwhile, Elise Stefanik returned home to a district that felt different. The applause lines weren't landing the same. The donors smiled but asked harder questions. In a local town hall in Saratoga Springs, she was confronted by a retired school principal who looked her straight in the eye and said, "You used to believe in education equity. I read your emails from 2021. What happened to that woman?" Elise didn't answer. She pivoted carefully, but the crowd didn't cheer. And that silence spoke louder than any policy statement ever could. Her staff assured her it would pass. News cycles move fast, they said, but something inside her knew this one wouldn't. Because even if she survived politically, something had fractured. A trust, a tether, and she couldn't shake the sound of Jasmine's voice in that empty hallway. "You chose the applause." That voice would not let her sleep. But the final chapter of this story didn't belong to Elise, or even Jasmine. It belonged to the ones who came after. Late one afternoon, in the hushed stillness of the Library of Congress, a young black student sat alone at a desk in the reading room. The ceilings arched above him like a cathedral. Shafts of soft light filtered through the tall windows, hitting the brass lamps on every table. Before him sat a printed transcript of the hearing, highlighted, circled, annotated. He wasn't studying for a test. He was studying for something else, something heavier. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, lips moving silently as he read the line for the third time. "I wasn't born to prove I'm worthy. I was born with worth." He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, the world had not changed. But he had. Around him, the library stayed quiet. But inside him, something had been claimed. Something no repeal, no committee vote, no political pivot could undo. Because Jasmine hadn't just delivered a rebuttal that day, she had planted a future. And the echo of her words would keep moving, through classrooms, protests, courtrooms, and yes, into quiet reading rooms, where someone someday would read that same sentence and remember that the fight for dignity never ends in defeat. It only begins again. It started small. One envelope, no return address. Just a single line on the back flap. To Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Inside was a letter written in blue ink, the words slightly slanted, the paper folded 4 times like someone had held it for days before sending. It read, "I watched the hearing. I've never written to anyone in government before, But when you said, I wasn't born to prove I'm worthy, I felt like you were talking to me. Thank you. I needed to hear it. I needed to believe it. Jasmine held the letter for a long time. Then came another, and another. Dozens, hundreds. They came in every form. Careful cursive, all caps, crayon on notebook paper, printed in Times New Roman with footnotes. Some were emailed. Others hand-delivered to her office by trembling constituents who didn't ask for selfies or autographs. They just wanted to say, you saw me. One letter came from a retired teacher in Mississippi. I taught black students for 30 years and never had the words to explain to them why they had to work twice as hard. You gave me those words. You gave me peace. Another from a high school senior in rural Ohio. We don't talk about race in my house. When I watched you, I finally understood why it matters. I want to be like you. A former Marine from Nevada wrote, I used to mock DEI. Then my daughter came out, and I watched your hearing. I was wrong. Thank you for teaching an old soldier something new. Some letters told stories of quiet pain. A black nurse passed over for promotion 5 times. A single mother in Georgia who stopped applying for federal jobs after one too many culture fit rejections. A Cherokee student who dropped out of college after being labeled diversity admission in front of classmates. Their stories had gone unseen for years, but now they spilled out like floodwater after a broken dam. Jasmine had cracked something open, and she read every single one. Late at night, when the news was too loud and her office too still, she would sit at her kitchen table with tea gone cold and hands ink-stained from opening envelope after envelope. She didn't respond to all of them. She couldn't, but she kept them, stacked neatly in folders marked with dates, tied with string, organized by state. Some she carried in her purse, others she tucked into her notebooks when traveling. A few she kept on her nightstand, so she'd never forget who she was fighting for when the world tried to make her forget. They weren't fan mail. They weren't praise. They were confirmation that someone was listening, that the truth mattered, that pain, when spoken without shame, could become a map for someone else. And Jasmine understood something Elise never could, that political power might waver with polls, but moral power, the kind that lives in letters, in trembling handwriting, in unspoken gratitude. That power doesn't fade, it multiplies. The letters weren't for her ego, they were for her armor. Because in a world quick to erase you, sometimes a single voice saying, you're not alone, can be the beginning of a revolution. The vote had passed. The policies were gone. The talking heads had moved on to newer scandals, flashier fights. But something strange happened in the silence that followed. The ground began to shift, not in Washington, but everywhere else. Jasmine Crockett had returned to work as if the world hadn't burned down in front of her. She filed bills, sat through committee meetings, responded to constituent calls. On the surface, she looked the same, but in reality, nothing was. The hearing, the confrontation, the letters, they had cracked something open inside the country and inside her. She had never been interested in statues, but without anyone planning it, they started to build something, not in stone, but in action, in echoes. It began on a campus in North Carolina. A student group, mostly first-generation college kids, painted a mural across the side of a campus cultural center. It showed Jasmine standing in profile, hand raised, eyes forward, her silhouette sharp against a backdrop of storm clouds parting. Above her were the words, I wasn't born to prove I'm worthy, I was born with worth. The administration didn't approve the mural, but they didn't take it down either. That same week, a high school in Oakland replaced the quote on its auditorium wall. Where it once said, success is the result of preparation, it now read, your presence isn't a privilege, it's a right. JC in Boston, a group of AP government students reenacted Jasmine's hearing in a debate competition. Not because it was assigned, but because they chose it. A Latina student played Jasmine. A white boy from Newton volunteered to be Stefanik. After the performance, they all sat together and discussed it, not like a play, but like a memory that had somehow become theirs too. In Atlanta, a local playwright turned the entire confrontation into a one-act performance. The final scene? A spotlight on a lone actress delivering Jasmine's line directly to the audience, voice cracking, You don't have to say the quiet part out loud. We hear it. We live it. Every single day when the lights came up, no one clapped right away. They sat in silence, like they just heard a confession that didn't belong to someone else, but to them. And then came the moment no one expected. 5 years after the vote that gutted DEI programs nationwide. On the floor of the House of Representatives, a new freshman congresswoman took the mic. She was 29th Afro-Latinx, from the Bronx, wore her natural curls in a tight crown, and carried herself like someone who knew exactly how many doors had been closed before hers was opened. Her first speech wasn't about policy, it was about memory, and she said, "This country has never been short on laws. What it's lacked is love. What it's lacked is listening." Congresswoman Crockett once stood in this room and said, "We weren't born to convince you we belong." I'm standing here today because she was right. We were born to lead. The chamber didn't erupt, but it did something rarer. It paused. And in that pause, something sacred flickered. Because Jasmine Crockett was no longer just a voice. She was a monument in motion, not a statue, not a marble carving, but a movement that lived in actions and echoes and anonymous hands painting murals in the night. The irony? She never saw any of it firsthand. She didn't go viral again. She didn't tweet about the tributes. She didn't retweet the murals. She stayed busy, meeting with families in border towns, testifying on rural school closures, quietly funding scholarships under the table. But one day, one ordinary Thursday, a package arrived at her office. Inside was a photograph. No note, no explanation. Just an image. A little girl, maybe 10 years old, standing in front of the mural on that North Carolina campus. She wore glasses too big for her face and held a hand-drawn sign above her head. It said, "Born with Worth." Jasmine stared at the photo for a long time. Then she framed it, hung it on the wall above her desk, right where the Capitol dome used to hang. Because now she understood something she never allowed herself to believe before. Her fight had never really been about policy. It had always been about permission, about giving others the courage to say what this country has long tried to deny. That being seen is not a favor. That equity is not a handout. That worth is not something you earn to fit in. It's something you protect to stand out. And so she kept moving. Not for glory, not for recognition, but because somewhere out there, a girl she'd never meet was standing a little taller. A boy with doubts was applying to law school. A teacher was rewriting her syllabus. A voter was asking a harder question. And that, she realized, was what legacy really meant. Not what you leave behind when you're gone, but what rises because you stayed. And as the photo of the little girl hung above Jasmine's desk, eyes bright, fists lifted, standing in front of a mural painted with defiance, the meaning of everything that had come before began to crystallize. Not in legislation, not in applause, but in the stillness after the storm, where truth could finally be heard without shouting. Because in the end, this was never just a story about one vote, one hearing, one face-off between two women in opposing parties. This was a story about the slow violence of being told over and over again that your value must be justified to exist, that your dignity is negotiable, that the only voices that matter are the ones that don't shake when they speak. Jasmine's journey wasn't a rise, it was a climb, a bloody-palmed, breathless climb through a system that wasn't built for people like her to survive, much less lead. Every committee room, every sidelong glance, every coded insult masked as decorum was a battle in a war no one wrote headlines for. And yet she kept showing up, not to win, because winning was never promised, but to remind them that truth doesn't need permission. That presence, when hard-earned, is its own form of protest. The human lesson isn't found in the triumph, it's found in the moment just before, the moment when your voice catches, when your body shakes, when the people in power look at you and expect silence, and instead you speak. You speak with trembling hands and steady truth. That's where change lives. Not in perfection, but in persistence. Not in control, but in courage. And the injustice Jasmine faced wasn't theatrical, it was intimate. It was the injustice of being told you're too emotional for naming pain. that you're too aggressive for defending your right to be heard, that your credentials don't count if they come wrapped in the wrong skin, from the wrong zip code, with the wrong tone. She didn't walk into that hearing to play a role. She walked in as herself. And for that, just for being, she was treated like a disruption. And still she stayed. Still she answered. Still she fought. Because the most dangerous lie a system can tell is that only certain people get to define professionalism, that only certain types of calm are valid, that passion from the powerful is called leadership, but from the marginalized, it's called disorder. Jasmine's refusal to shrink was not ego. It was resistance. And from that resistance, a deeper truth emerged. We are not meant to spend our lives proving we belong to people who benefit from pretending we don't. We are not here to audition for justice or beg for recognition. We are not here to wait quietly for our turn while the room keeps shifting the rules. We are here to build the rooms we were never invited into. That is the lesson, not just for Jasmine, not just for Elise, but for all of us. Because the systems we inherit are not neutral. They remember who built them. They remember who they were meant to exclude. And if we want to change them, we must be willing to speak even when our voices shake. We must be willing to stay standing even when the gavel drops. And perhaps most importantly, we must remember that justice isn't a destination. It's a discipline. It is not won once. It is practiced daily. In meetings, in classrooms, in boardrooms, at dinner tables where hard truths must be said even if they ruin the mood. Jasmine's power wasn't in being loud. It was in being unflinching. In refusing to apologize for a presence that made others uncomfortable only because it was honest. She didn't need permission to be powerful. She needed only to remember that power given by others can always be taken, but power rooted in truth cannot be moved. And that is what lives on. Not just in her words, but in the students now quoting her in debates, in the veterans rethinking what patriotism means, in the mothers telling their daughters they don't have to tone it down to be respected. This isn't about one congresswoman. It's about what happens when truth enters a room that's used to being comfortable. It's about what happens when someone refuses to play small so others can feel big. It's about the courage to disrupt a lie so old it sounds like tradition. And if there is a monument to be built, let it not be in stone. Let it be in every moment someone decides to stay visible in a place designed to erase them. Let it be in every question that starts with, who are we building this for? Because when enough people ask that question, loudly, stubbornly, relentlessly, the room begins to change. And the lesson Jasmine Crockett left behind isn't about politics. It's about memory, about reclaiming it, and about never letting anyone else write the ending for you. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.